So the first thing that you had to do was create a loop for, and I said you could use a for or a while. How many people tried to use a for loop? Did anybody use a while? For just, it makes more, I understand it immediately. I remember the syntax better with the for. I've had while loops in other languages that the syntax was a little different. So I never can remember with JavaScript what the exact syntax is of the while. So for is sort of my go-to loop usually. I don't know that I've ever seen a scenario that I couldn't do with a for loop what I was doing with a while, or vice versa. So either one of them will work. I like the way with the for, like the variable that's kind of controlling your loop and what the condition is for checking that variable and how you're incrementing that variable. I like the fact that it's all contained in the top of the for loop. So it's just really easy for me to know immediately what's controlling my loop. So that's what I went with here. I initialized a variable I to 1. I is kind of a common variable in JavaScript that you'll see, like if you're reading any book on JavaScript, a lot of times you'll see that variable as the variable that's declared at the beginning of your for loop, and that you're incrementing and cycling through and checking the value of. It's really common to use I for that, but you can use whatever you want. This is just a variable, right? Any valid variable name will work here. So I could say my cool variable, right? My cool var. And as long as I replaced everywhere I used I with my cool var, then that would work as well. But just for simplicity's sake, and because this is what is so commonly used, I used I here. So I start with a value of 1 for I. And every time my for loop is going to check and see, is I less than 5? Less than or equal to 5. And if it is, so remember the way for loops work. The first thing that happens as the browser is reading through your code and executing your JavaScript is it says, it looks at this var statement first, and it says, okay, we've declared a variable named I, and we've initialized that variable value to 1. Okay, and then it checks the condition. So this is kind of like an if statement, right? If I meets these conditions, if the variable we've declared, or we could have any condition in here. If this condition is true, then I'm going to go down here and run the code that's inside my for loop. Right? So that's kind of the execution order. Declare a variable first. This is really only looked at the first time that the browser encounters this for loop. It initializes the variable. It doesn't really ever go back and look at that again. Then it checks each time. It's going to check the condition before it runs the code. If the condition is true, and initially it is, because 1 is less than or equal to 5, then it's going to run this code here. After it runs the code, it runs this piece at the end, which in our code is just going to increment the value of 1 by 1 more, or increment the value of I by 1. So just to kind of talk through that with real numbers, the first time what happens, it sets a variable I equal to 1. Then it checks to see is 1 less than 5. It is. So it writes out that value of I, which is 1 in this case, to the console. Then it's going to increment I by 1. So now I becomes not 1, but 2. And so it checks my condition again. Is 2 less than or equal to 5? It is. So run the code. Write 2 out to the console. Increment I by 1 again. So now I becomes 3. Checks my condition. Is 3 less than or equal to 5? It is. So run this code again. So it's going to do that every time and run the code as long as my condition is met. Now, at the point at which I gets incremented and becomes the number 6, that's the point at which this thing's going to say, is this condition met? No, 6 is not less than or equal to 5. So it jumps out of my for loop and moves on, never to visit it again. Okay. Does that process make sense to you guys as you're thinking through the way the loops work? So just to kind of see this, since I was writing this, since the instruction was to write this to the console, what's the only way that I'm going to be able to verify that this works? I have to either inspect or launch the console, either by coming over here and choosing developer tools or using a hotkey like Control-Shift-I or F12 on some of our computers. So if I launch developer tools and I go to the console, nothing has run yet because my I basically have these other boxes that are sort of holding things up. And I'm just gonna enter. Let's see if anything wrote yet. Still not. I'm just gonna do some stuff here. Yes. All right. Or no. All right. So now it finally, those prompts sort of lock up writing to the console. So that's why I wasn't writing anything until I kind of finished for everything. But there it is. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 got written out to the console when I did that. Any questions about the for loop, that portion of the project? All right. What was the next piece? We're going to interact with the user. And we were supposed to ask for the user's age and prompt the user to enter his or her age. Assign the value they enter to the variable age. Did everybody understand those instructions? Does that make sense? All right. I've had students before that were like, I don't understand what that means. And I was trying to say it as plainly and as simply as I could. It means we're creating a variable named age, right? That's what I'm doing right here. And then whatever comes back from the prompt that the user enters, I'm going to assign that to that variable age. All right. Now, I forgot to mention something whenever I sent this to you guys. I mentioned the use of parse int in a later section. I forgot to mention it here. And so again, this is one of those areas that I wanted you to make an attempt at it. If you couldn't get it to work, I'm going to give these solutions to you guys and you can check out how I did it. I am going to email this out to you. So I don't want you to get distracted as we're going through it with trying to reproduce it right now. If you don't understand it, make sure that you understand it. Okay, that's the most important point right now. Yes.
So doesn't parsing just like get rid of the decimals?
Well, what it's doing is it's taking, in this case, it's taking a string, and if it can convert that string into an integer, that's what it's doing. And so the reason I'm having to do that is whenever so here's when I prompt the user to enter an age, right? This is the code that's doing that. So a box is going to come up that says enter your age. What this method returns is a string. So if I enter in an age of 25, what prompt sends back as far as this request goes is it's not a number 25, but it sends back a string 25. Well, if I've got a string, I can't do any kind of math operations with it. I can't really accurately check things like greater than, less than, and stuff like that. It won't blow up on you when you're trying to do greater than, less than, and things like that. It'll still do it because JavaScript does have an understanding of the fact that in the alphabet, A comes before B. So if I check to see if A is less than B, JavaScript will say, yes, it is, because it comes earlier in the alphabet. And so it still will kind of do some comparisons, but it's doing those comparisons looking at your numbers as strings and not as your numbers as numbers. So have you ever noticed, like when you sort file names on a computer system, like you might have, maybe you're putting a number at the beginning of all of your files, or not necessarily that. Like when I do put test on here. So in this class, we've had 7 tests, right? But in some of my classes, like chemistry, we have like 15 tests, right? Not counting, 15 tests in all, I think. Well, if I do test 1, as I'm creating my Word document files for that, if I were to go test 1, test 2, test 3, test 4, test 5, test 6, all the way down to test 10, test 11, test 12. You ever noticed on a computer system, if I try to sort that, it does test 1, and then instead of showing test 2 next in the sort, it'll show test 10, test 11, test 12, and then it goes to test 2 after all of those. Why? Why on a... Yeah, why would it say test 1 ... is first, and then test 10 ... is next. Let's just say I had 10 tests, and then it would say test 2 ... would come next when sorting that. Why would it do that?
Because it's counting to the right of the decimal. Or sorry, the other way around.
No, that's not. It's not really the decimal. It's not nothing to do with the decimal here.
It's like 1, 0. So
The way that it's thinking about this, because what if I had done this? Test A ... and then test B ... But let's say later I had a test AA. Where's it going to be put test AA? It's going to put it right here, right? So alphabetically, that makes sense, right? Because the A is less than B, so that should go in here. Well, what it's looking at here is it's looking at this as a string. and it's saying this one has right after test, it has 1, and this one has a 1 right after test. So this should go after that, right? And before this number 2, because if I'm thinking about it like an alphabet where it's 1, 2, 3, 4, this is a 1 here, so it comes before the 2. That's why that works. So what do I end up doing to make sure that this thing sorts properly? I put 0, 1 for my test name, and I put 0, 2 for my test 2, and then they all sort alphabetically the way that I want them to, right? But my point is, it sorts differently if you're thinking about those as strings versus thinking about those as numbers. And so the reason I've got parse int here when the age comes back is I want to make sure that what's stored in my variable age is a number and not a string, okay? So that whenever I'm doing these checks here to see if your age is between 20 and 30, it's actually looking at that numerically. Yes? Someone say so? Yeah.
Okay, never mind, you don't have equal to or less than there at the top.
Yeah.
I saw 30 on both spots.
Right. So notice that. So what I'm doing here as I'm doing my if statements, I wanted you guys to use ands or ors. And so in this case, I'm using an and I'm saying if the age is greater than or equal to 20, or if it's that, and it's also whatever age they entered is not less than or equal to 30, but less than 30, then I'll put a thing that says you're in your 20s. Why did I not say less than or equal to 30? Exactly. If someone had entered their age as 30, I don't want to tell them they're in their 20s. They clearly just got in their 30s, right? So I say less than 30. So if they said, I'm 29.9999 years old, it would say, okay, you're in your 20s, right? And so then I do the same thing with this age range of 30. And that was the only age range I wanted you guys to check. So I'm testing a couple of things here and letting you play around with a couple of things here. Using if statements and including the else if part of the if statement. And also making sure you understand how to use else all by itself. That's sort of what it falls through. If it doesn't match any of the previous conditions, it'll print that out. And then also, if you're make sure that you know how to use the and. We're anding a couple of things together here, right? Is it greater than or equal to 20 and is it less than 30? So that's what that one was all about. Again, I'm going to share this code with you guys so you can kind of go over it and make sure that you understand how it works, because I want to be sure that you understand the concepts before we get tested on it. Yes.
Real quick, with the if else, my code, it looks the same as your saying that
Unexpected else. So I'm guessing that maybe you didn't close a curly brace, or you didn't open a curly brace, or you didn't close a parentheses somewhere. Usually it's something like that. You forgot, you left off something like that. So I got to try to get through this so that we have time to cover it all. But what I would recommend is when I send you the code, make sure that the code I'm sending you works. So then you'll know that the code does in fact work, right? And then compare mine kind of line by line with yours to make sure that you haven't overlooked something. Okay. Like I would do something like let's say this was your code, and let's say you, let's say you forgot to put that closing parentheses in there. Okay. Right after 30, then it's not going to work. So I would, if you're looking at my code going, well, his code works and why doesn't my code work? Then you could do something like copy this line in my code, right? And then come over to your document and paste it in. So now if I paste those two in, one right after the other, I can look at it and go, oh, I see it, right? This is missing. So that's one way that you could kind of test it and compare the two together. There's also a way to, in here, look at stuff side by side. So you could have them both up on the screen on the same time inside Notepad++. I just don't remember how to do that immediately. So let's go into the next one just very quickly. This is where you're prompting the user and asking about the day of the week. And this is where you're going to have some statement that will, I did want you guys to discover that whenever you call using the date object, when you say, give me the day, that's what this code right here is doing, get day, it's going to return a number. It returns 0 for Sunday, 1 for Monday, 2 for Tuesday, and so on, right? So you're going to have to yourself, in all the years of JavaScript, they've never added a function off of the a method in the date object that will give you back the day, the alphanumeric day of the week. And I don't know, maybe they just got overwhelmed and said, this is used all across the world in all sorts of languages, and we don't want to have to keep up with the days of the week in all the different languages. Maybe there are some particular challenges there that I'm not familiar with, right? But they do tell you the day of the what month it is. They'll give you that as a they might actually give you. Let me see something real quick here.
Does it returns like if you just do it like all of them, all the everything like for the date or whatever, it says like WED for Wednesday.
Yeah, I was just thinking. I think it does that in the. So what he's saying is, so if I do it here in my JavaScript console, var dt equals new date, and so now I can do date.getDay. Here's what I get back, 4, because today's Thursday. So if I started with Sunday being 0, then 4 would be Thursday. But if I would just want to see what the current date is, I could just check the value of dt and look at the beginning of that. It says THU. So it knows it in there that for my local time, it is in fact Thursday, but they just don't give you a method where you can just request that portion of it, right? So there are some string things that I could do. Like this is just a string, and there's a way for me to split up a string based on spaces and look at the individual words in that string. So I could maybe split it up and get the first word that's in my string, but it's not going to give me the full name if I want Thursday instead of just the 3-character abbreviated name, right? So what I decided to do was use a series of if-else statements. So I called getDay, and I stored that in day of week number was what I called that variable. And then I created this other variable that initially doesn't have anything in it, but just an empty string, right? I just did quote, quote, put an empty string in there. And so then I start checking if day of the week equals 0, then I set the day of the week string to Sunday, and else otherwise I set it to something else. And so this was a way that I did it. There were other options. The book gave you a way to use a switch statement to do it, right? So a switch statement is basically just a series of if else's. It's the same basic idea. So again, switch statements got a little more complicated syntax that I just don't remember off the top of my head. And I remember if else statements very well. So this is typically how I go about doing this. Switch statement will probably save you a couple lines of code. Definitely save you some characters. So if you're going for writing your code as nice and concise as possible, then a switch statement would be the better way to go. And like I said, you can look at that in your book and see how they did it. I'm not going to go all the way through how I did this, because I've actually used this one here to introduce a topic that I want to talk about today, this particular part of the assignment. I do want to stress this. If I'm checking the value of my day of week number, make sure that you never do this. I think I went over this last week, but I just want to emphasize that again. If you say day of week number equals 0, what did I just do?
You set it to 0.
I set it to 0. I just made a variable assignment, right? I set the value of that variable to 0. So make sure that you always use double equals if you're testing to see what value's in there, right? Yes.
So can you not use parentheses and just use one equal sign so the variable one?
So
there's like the line above it, you made variable string. You have parentheses show that like the variable is what would be inside parentheses.
So you're talking about the parentheses on this line versus the lack of parentheses on this line?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, so the reason I'm using parentheses here is just because I'm in an if statement. So the way that the format of the if statement is if, and then you'll have some parentheses that says if that we know the parentheses contains the condition that my if statement is checking. Okay, so that's why we use parentheses there. It's a condition for my if statement to run. So if this condition is true, then run whatever code is inside of this if statement. And so it's kind of like the for loop. We use for up here at the very beginning, we use parentheses right here in our for loop. And that's just because that's the syntax for using a for loop. Okay, that you put all that stuff inside parentheses. Likewise, the syntax for using an if statement is you'll have if and then some condition that you're checking, and that condition always shows up in parentheses. Okay. The other line that you were talking about is a line where I was just assigning a value to a variable, and I don't need parentheses for that. There may be reasons why I would want to use a parentheses, but I don't necessarily need them. And so that's why there's no parentheses like in this variable assignment here. I'm just assigning a value to that variable. Okay. Does that help? Sort of. Just through use, I think some of these things start clicking. The more that you do it, the more familiar you become with it. The other thing that we had to do here was, so I'm going to just kind of run my code again. Let me refresh my page. So it asked me my age. I'm going to say, I'm going to, of course, give my accurate, honest age. I'm 28. I don't know if I ever told you guys that. You're in your 20s, so cool. It knows what I'm in. Then it asked me for a radius. And that was, did I miss that code? I guess I did, right? Where was that? Yeah, somehow I missed that using the math stuff. This is where I told you to use parseInt, right? Because we were going to be doing some math calculations on it. So again, I'll give you guys this code, and you can reach out if you have questions about the way that I did that. But yes.
There's also an exponential option,
For the R, yeah, to do R squared.
You do like the
I don't know. Will that work? I've never used that. So you're saying asterisk 2 will raise it to that?
I didn't try that for mine, but I saw it on double schools.
Okay. So similar to the way we do plus plus, which adds 1 to it, I can do asterisk and then give whatever the power is, and it'll raise it to that power. Well, let's see. So let me finish. I'm going to enter a radius of 3. So when I enter a radius of 3, I get an area of my circle as 28.27. You guys remember that number? Okay. So I'm just going to kind of blast through all this. You know what? I don't even need to do it this way. Yes, because we'll just go to the console here and try that out. So let's see. You're saying I can do var r equals 3. Right? And then if I do R star 2, hey, that's cool. I had no idea you could do that.
Can you also do or arrow 2?
I don't think that will work. Yeah, that doesn't work. Yeah, interestingly enough, right? Why would that be? R is 3. R caret. I have no idea why it returned 1. I'm not sure what the caret symbol, what it thinks that is there. So I know there is something hanging off of the square root object. I'm off of the math object for like doing square root. So I could use this method here for like taking the square root of 9. So there's some methods available to you off the math object to do.
I think it's
the other direction. You think it subtracts?
Yeah.
Oh, it subtracts 2. Okay. Yeah. So let's see. So if R equals, let's see if R equals 8, and then I'll try R caret 2. What? So added 2 that time. It's bizarre. What is R? R is still 8. That's weird. Yeah, I can't explain that. But that's cool with the star 2, and we'll have to figure out what the caret is. I'll tell you what, for extra credit, we won't give the answer. If you can email me and tell me what the R caret 2 or whatever value, if you can tell me what that will do, I'll give you some extra credit. All right. So a little opportunity there for you to up your grade a little bit. So anyway, I did want you guys to notice that in my code here, the difference between using the math object and using the date object that we were looking at just a moment ago. When you use the math object, you just call math, and then you're either going to use some property hanging off of the math object. Like in this case, I'm using the property pi, which is equal to, the 3.14 blah, 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 blah. Or I'm calling some method off the math object. So I just type in math.round, in this case, where I want to round my area value to the appropriate integer value. So I actually type in the word math, and that's what all of my methods and properties are hanging off of. However, for the date object, I don't do that. For the date object, I create a variable and assign a new date object to that variable name. So I have to do this step first when I'm working with the date object. I'll say new date. And so now DT is going to be a date, whereas I didn't have to do that with math. If I wanted the value of pi, I didn't have to first assign to a variable a math object and get the value of pi. I just said math.pi. And it sort of makes sense why they would do it that way, because math.pi, that never changes, right? That's always going to be the same. Math.round, and I'm going to pass in some number. The way that you round in math never changes, right? So I would call math.round and pass in 9.5 and it returns 10. That's always the same. But with the date, the methods that are all and the properties that are hanging off of the date object, they will vary depending on what the current date is. Do you guys see that? So if I get day, it's going to tell me 4 today because it's Thursday, but yesterday it would have told me 3. And so I have to create a new date object, because when I say var dt equals new date, it gets the current date right now when that code ran down to the millisecond. And so all of your operations from that standpoint on that are against this DT object here are going to be based on whatever time it was when you initially created this variable and called new date. So that's why some of these you have to do new, the object name, whereas others, like with math, you just say the object name with its math dot, and then you run whatever you want to run off of it. Okay, so you'll see that in JavaScript. Most of the time, this is the more common scenario where you're creating an object and it's sort of unique for how you're using that object. It's not one of those things that's always going to be the same, like math is. Okay. The other thing that I use in here is 2 uppercase. I tried to sort of direct you guys your attention to that, because you want to, if I'm asking a question here, where is it? Where's my, did I close it? Let me run it again. There it is. So if I, your age, I'm 3, I don't know how old you are. Radius of 5, there you are, rounded to 79. Is your day going well? If I type in yes, like that, or if I type in yes in all caps, or if I type in yes like that, I want it to recognize that I'm typing in yes in all those cases, right? And so that's why I used uppercase, so that whenever the user responds, I take whatever they respond to the question, is your day going well, right here, when I prompt that, I take that value that comes back from prompt and I convert it to uppercase. So the string that comes back, just to kind of think through this process real quick, prompt, is your day going well, will return a string, the string that the user entered. And so the string object has a method hanging off of it called 2 uppercase. So the string that comes back, I call the 2 uppercase method on that. And so that will return whatever I entered in the prompt box in all uppercase letters. All right. So my yes, regardless of whether I used any combination of lower or uppercase letters, it will always come back looking like that. So that way, when I check it inside my if statement, I can only check, did it match capital yes, right? There's lots of other things that you need to sort of think about, because you never know what a user is going to enter in a box like that, right? I'm being simplistic and assuming they would at least enter yes in one form or fashion.
Mine in a loop where it would, if it can't take that answer, you have to do that again.
Yeah, right. You just prompt them again. So yeah, you could keep doing that. And maybe you could prompt them and say, please enter yes or no, right? Or when I asked the question, I could have done something like, is your day going well? And I could have put, in parentheses here, yes or no, so that they know that's what I'm expecting, something like that.
You could go after the parentheses and put a comma and then put that as another string. That would be the default text in the box.
Yeah, so you could do that. You could show the default text in the box. So there's some different options there, but I did want you to just understand that's how I'm converting it to uppercase. All right. So we've got 15 minutes and I don't have time to go through, dig into this code any deeper. But what I want to show you with the last little bit of time that we have is I want to introduce you to the idea of events and the idea of functions in JavaScript. And since I've already got a function here, we'll talk about functions first, okay? Functions, you'll use functions in JavaScript when you're wanting to encapsulate some code that you intend to use more than once, all right? And so I've already got this code modified to use a function here because day of the week, I'm going to use that more than once, right? So if the user returns yes, then I want to say, hey, I'm glad you're having a great Thursday, right? If the user returns no, I'm going to say, I hope your Thursday gets better. So I need to know the day of the week in a couple of places in my code. And so what I did is I pulled that out into a function. All right. So functions can be used to organize your code so that it's maybe easier to see what part of your code is responsible for what. So, you know, if your code has a very logical group of processes that you kind of think of as step 1, step 2, step 3, maybe I could include like my step 1 code all in one function and then have my step 2 code in one function and my step 3 code in another function. And then when my program runs, I just say run step 1, now run step 2, now run step 3. That might be how I use a function, but usually you use functions to like I said, encapsulate some code that you want to run more than once. All right. So what I did is I just created a function that says return whatever the current day of the week is. All right. And so when that function runs, so that the syntax for that, the syntax for a function is just function, use this super cryptic keyword function to create a function, right? Function, my function, I'll just abbreviate that, my FN. This is just a variable name. So it has the same rules as any variable name does. Whatever you can't use spaces in variable names, so you'd never create a function that has spaces in it. You can use numbers in here. There are some symbols that are allowed, but some symbols that aren't. So you'd have to look at the rules for variable names to know what's valid, but it's just a variable. You can call that function whatever you want to call it. So my function, and then you have an open close parentheses. Now there may be something that we have in here that's beyond the scope of this class. We'll get into that in next year's class if you take that one. But it's basically, this is how you're able to pass values into the function that you're calling. And we've already done that. Every time we call alert, and then we give it some string, right? We're calling the alert function, and we're passing into that function this string value. And then the function uses that string value and pops up a box and displays it in our browser. Okay, so we're using functions already. Every time we've called something where you had some name and then a parentheses after it, like console.log, open parentheses, we're calling a function every time we do that. All of these things hanging off of the date object and the math object where you had to use parentheses. If it's hanging off of an object, we call it a method, but it's really just a function inside that method, inside that object. Okay, so this is how you declare a function. So you can pass in values to that function, or you don't have to pass in values to that function, but you do always have to have these parentheses here. All right. Like I said, next year we'll talk about actually passing in values. So function, my function, and then you have an open parentheses, and we use this often in JavaScript, not parentheses, open curly brace, and you'll have a closing curly brace, right? We use that a lot to kind of enclose a set of code. And so basically all these lines of code now that are inside here, that's considered to be code that's a part of this function. Okay, does that make sense to everybody? So what I did is I created a function that says, whenever I call this function that I've called get day of the week, I want you to return to me the string value of the day of the week. All right, at whatever time I called this function. So if I were to call this function in my code tomorrow, it's still going to give me the day of the week for the moment at which the function was called. Okay. So get day of the week, and you can review the code here to kind of see what's going on. That should make sense to you. Here's the other key thing. Functions have the option of returning a value. They don't always have to, but they can. And some functions don't return a value. Right, that's why, when we call the alert box, if I call alert, if I look right here and I say Is this, let me see if my browser is still doing anything. It's not. If I say alert, hello, whoops, F11, alert, hello, and I call that function, right? It pops up an alert. Where did it go? Is it here? There it is. It's on this one. Pops up an alert and says hello. And when I click OK, the function's done running. And that's why I get undefined right here. That undefined doesn't mean that there was a problem when I called that function. It just means the function didn't return a value. I wasn't expecting anything back from alert. Okay. But what about prompt? Now prompt works very differently, right? If I say prompt and say enter a number, right? If I do that and I hit 3, I need to know what number the user entered, right? And so the prompt function, whenever I call it, it returns the value 3, which is the value that the user entered in the box. So it has a return value. And so the way that you return something in a function, so you can have all these lines of code that do whatever, but if it's going to return a value, you have to use the return keyword, okay? And then whatever value you want to return. All right. What's my value going to be? What does it make sense that my value would be when I call a function named get day of the week? What am I expecting that function to tell me? The what?
The month and year.
Yeah, right. The day of the week, I get the month of the year. No, I get the day of the week, right? I'm going to get Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, something like that. And so that's exactly what my function does. When you look at my code, it says, here's the function called get day of the week. And what's that function going to return? It's going to return the day of week string that I just figured out with my if else statements. Okay. And so now, because I'm in the context of since my console has all of this code that was that's running on this particular browser page, it's aware of that. I can actually call my get day of the week function right here and say, give me the day of the week. And it returns Thursday because I abbreviated. I started off doing them all and then I abbreviated just to show you that it's actually mine. Here, we'll change it. We'll do it full and we'll refresh my screen. When I do that, it's going to ask for all this information again. Okay. All right. Yes. All right. Great. And so now if I called get day of the week again, now there's the full string, right? Yeah, go for it. You're going to miss this super important part, but I'm going to put this video online. All right. So you can review it. All right. Does that make sense to everybody though? The basics of how functions work and the purpose of functions. Right now I've got a function like every JavaScript, since JavaScript doesn't provide you this out of the box. You could have sort of like some base code that you always include in all of your JavaScript that you're creating. So this could just be a function that you always include in all of your JavaScript. So if you ever need the day of the week, you can always, you always have a function that you can call and get that information, right? I could just copy this code over and over again into other JavaScript programs. And it'll always work, right? Because it's just getting whatever the current day is and figuring out what the day of the week is. And so that's where I called that up here. When the user entered yes, when they said my variable, let's see, prompt, I'm going to make this a little more meaningful. Variable, is your day going well? And I'll just call that response. And if the response was yes, whoops, I just did copy. If the response was yes, I said, I'm glad, I did a string here and said, I'm glad you're having a wonderful, and then I concatenated. You guys remember what concatenate means with strings? What does that mean?
You add variable or some other function into it.
Yeah, I just connect those two strings together, right? And so when I do plus between two strings, it doesn't try to do arithmetic. When I do plus between two strings, it just says, oh, you want me to put those two strings together and make one new string out of it, right? So I'm glad you're having a wonderful, and then what I concatenate to that is whatever my get day of the week function returns. So I just say, I call the get day of the week function, I call it, it returns the string Thursday. And so it concatenates to this first string here, the word Thursday, and then it also concatenates an exclamation point at the end and returns that response. But if they didn't respond yes, then I can call my function again and say, I hope your, in this case, Thursday, I call get day of the week again, gets better. All right, does that basic concept make sense to you guys? Any questions about that? Hey, you're back before this super important part, so good job. All right, so that's what I wanted to show you with functions. The last thing that I wanted to show you was events. And there's all kind of events that we could talk about in JavaScript. One event that's really easy to use, it would be really easy for you to just incorporate into something right now, because you guys are already familiar with this, is the onClick event. All right, so just about any HTML object on your page, you could add this attribute, onClick equals, and it will, and then you could have it run some JavaScript or call a JavaScript function or something like that. Okay, so for this particular one here, I've added to my H1, to my header on the page, an onClick attribute. And so whenever that event happens, in other words, when someone clicks on the H1 on my page, this particular H1, the browser says, okay, a JavaScript event just happened. It's the onClick event for this particular header 1 tag. Is there any code that's supposed to run when that happens? And so that event gets recognized, and if there's code associated with that event, then it'll run that code. So this is kind of how you guys would have been able to do that when you click the login button. This is how you would have executed that code and then kind of made it an if else, you know, if they enter this name, go to this page. If they enter this name, go to this page, or something like that. But I'm going to call a function here. I don't have to call a function I created. I could call any function. I could just type directly in alert, you know, do an alert box there, type in some JavaScript code. I could do multiple lines of JavaScript code as long as I separate them by semicolons. That's fine. Notice in here though, because my attribute, you know, we always enclose the value of the attribute with these double quotes. When I make the call to alert, I had to use single quotes because it gets confused with double quotes if you do double quotes twice. If I had done double quotes here, it would have gotten confused about what the value of the attribute was. So I'm not going to quiz you on that, but I just want you to understand why I would be calling alert with single quotes like that. But like I said, I'm not going to call the alert function. I'm going to call a function that I created that's have a good day. So have a good, it's this one right here. You have to copy it exactly like you named that function. JavaScript is case sensitive, so you have to use the same case on all the letters, and you have to put open close parentheses there, because that's how it knows that it's a function call. All right, and so if there is a function with that name defined somewhere on your page, it will call it when that H1 is clicked on, and there is a function on the page called that. So have a good day. And this is what I'm just going to have a good day. It's going to pop up an alert box. It's going to call my day of the week method again, and function again, and it's going to run so that it can get the day of the week back, and then it's going to display my message. So just to show you guys how that works, now that that's in here, if I click on homework 8C, it pops up that message, right? And I could click anywhere on it. If I'd put a big border, notice I'm way out here, and it's still working. And the reason why is because for headers, even if you don't realize that it's running the full length of the page, they run the full length of the page. So we could see that very easily by just adding a style and adding the background color. Style equals, let's see, background color, and we'll just set it to yellow. So we'll be able to see it with our text. So if I do that, and I reload my page, and of course, when I do this now, it's going to ask all this stuff again. Okay, there it is. So now we can see that it runs the full length of the page. So clicking anywhere inside there is going to pop up that message. All right. So that's the way events work. That's just the onClick one. There's on mouse over. There's on mouse out. There's a slew of JavaScript events that are happening when you're typing in. You ever notice that if you're typing in a text box on some websites and you mistype something, it will immediately let you know that that's an invalid character or something like that. Maybe you're typing in a credit card number. If I accidentally hit an A, it'll say enter a valid credit card number. That's because there's an event. There's a key press event. And every time you press a key and enter something, it can check that value. So there's all kind of ways that you can interact with the user if you start using events, but this is just us kind of dipping our toe. It'll be a big part of what we cover next year in next year's class.